Welcome to Book Banter with me, your host, Dianne Burckhardt. I hope you will join me every Wednesday as we explore all things to do with, well, books. Let's get on with our show today. Hello, my happy people. Today is December 21st, 2022, and today is a special episode of Book Banter with Dianne Burckhardt. This is the season finale for our first season. Oh my gosh, I cannot even believe that I managed to do 45 episodes this past season. When I first started out trying to build an indie author career, I was not good at staying consistent with doing my blogs and my podcasts and TikTok whenever I first started all of these things. But somehow I have learned to be consistent. Now, I'm sure if you've been following me from the very beginning, you know that I basically started out having no clue about how to do a podcast. And if you listen to the early ones, that's probably fairly evident. I mean, after all, this show started out as Whatever Wednesdays. It was just me taking my regular blog that I did on Wednesdays and taking it into a podcast. And it took me a while to figure out what I really wanted to do with this, because the things that I was doing for the Whatever Wednesday blog did not really translate well to a podcast. And eventually I came around to just saying, I'm an author. I want to talk about books. We're going to make it a book themed podcast, and Book Banter with Dianne Burckhardt was born. I started out with just some very basic equipment that I already had at home. I did get to upgrade because of sponsors who donated coffees on the Buzzsprout website. It has a sponsor, the podcast button that you can click, and it takes you to a thing where you can buy coffees for the host. And we put that money towards buying new equipment, new software, everything that comes in from that support our podcast by buying us a coffee thing goes directly to creating better podcasts. And I still have some things that I need to get, but I'm going to have to save some money for that too. I want to improve the soundproofing in the area where I'm doing the recordings, and I'm trying to learn how to do a little bit better editing, and I really, really need to get some better software for the recordings. Right now, I'm just using a free service to do it, and it's great, but it doesn't work quite right with a Mac, and I have to do workarounds every single episode. So I'd kind of like to buy something that is made to go for podcasts on the Mac. And hopefully I can work that all out here very soon so that I can be bringing you better sound quality for all of these interviews that I want to do for season 2. I haven't even scratched the surface of some of the amazing writers and publishers that I have met in my lifetime. And I want to bring them all to you so that you can get to meet them too, because they are just so fascinating and talented, and their stories deserve to be heard, and they deserve to be heard by you. So, I really wanted to talk today about Christmas traditions, because it's no secret to people who really know me. I have never really been big on Christmas. I'm just not. It was never, traditionally, it was not a great time of year for me. And so I started developing all of these personal traditions that kind of made it not Christmas this time of year. I would always have Chinese food for dinner on Christmas Eve. I would wait until Christmas Eve to go out and buy a tree and put it up. And I would always take the tree down the day after Christmas. And I would watch horror movies all day long on like Christmas Eve and Christmas Day if I was spending it at home by myself. And I carried these traditions for years until I met and married my husband, who happens to be very, very big on Christmas. So now in our home, we decorate the entire apartment by the first day of Advent, and the decorations do not get to come down, and the tree does not come down until the Epiphany in January. So it is a very different experience for me since I have been married. I'm trying very hard every year to get into being more Christmassy. I pull out the Christmas tree and it's ready to go for Advent. We have an Advent wreath. We have bedspreads and decorative pillows and special placemats that are all Christmassy. And I am actually starting to get into more Christmas movies. I don't just watch horror movies anymore on Christmas. And I would try and watch the ones that were Christmas themed. It wasn't just like watching Nightmare on Elm Street for Christmas. I was watching things like watching Gremlins because that one happened at Christmas. He was a Christmas present. And, things that had a Christmas theme to them, but were scary movies. But since my husband is not into scary movies at all, I shouldn't say that. He likes scary movies. He doesn't like slasher movies. So that's something that we definitely have that is different about us. I love like Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and, those kinds of movies. But he is very into the traditional kind of Christmas movies. So we've started doing things like on Christmas Eve, we will watch, White Christmas, It's a Wonderful Life, all of those traditional holiday movies. And I did have already the collection of stop motion animation Christmas shows, Santa Claus is Coming to Town and Frosty the Snowman, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, all of those stop motion Christmas shows from my childhood. I had those collections already. I did love those traditional Christmas things. So we do watch those together. But the two things that I was not willing to compromise on with him is we still do Chinese food for New Year's Eve. And then we do a traditional full Christmas dinner on Christmas Day. But the first movie that we have to watch every year on Christmas Eve is Die Hard. I will not give that one up. I even made a Die Hard Christmas tree ornament of John McClane in the air shaft. I just looked up directions for it online and made my own, and that's on our tree every year, center eye level of the tree. And my husband just laughs at me. He thinks it's funny. I even have, we always do new ugly Christmas sweaters or t-shirts every year for Christmas. We get new ones. We've done Star Wars and things like that. But last year I got me a Nakatomi Plaza Christmas party t-shirt that I wore for Christmas. And I got him one that was from Home Alone. It had like Merry Christmas, You Filthy Animal on it. So we do have a lot of fun with Christmas, and we do try and bring in some things that do incorporate what both of us enjoy. And this year will be even more special because we will have one of our daughters with us. We have twin daughters, and Connie has been here before for Christmas, but Mary has never been able to be here for Christmas. So this year, she is going to join us for Christmas because both of the girls live in Chile with their biological mother. And it will be so much fun for us to have Mary here. And we're really looking forward to this. She hasn't been to the Christmas markets here in Germany before, so we get to show her that. And we've got, special plans for New Year's Eve since she's going to be here until the 2nd of January. And it's just going to be a lot of fun, which is also why I am taking a break from doing my blogs and doing the podcast, why I decided to stop season 1 now. And I'm going to be starting up season 2 again in February. It'll be the first Wednesday in February that season 2 starts. But I wanted to be able to spend this quality time with my family since we're only going to have Mary here with us for 2 weeks. And it's going to be so much fun. And I hope all of you have fantastic plans, that you have traditions that you have built together as families and friends, and you are looking forward to a wonderful holiday season and a fantastic and prosperous new year. Before I close out this show, I want to share something with you. Last year for Christmas, for people who had joined my mailing list at burkhartbooks.com, I wrote a special tie-in Christmas story for the Into the West Saga serial that I write as Dianne Burckhardt. I decided that this year I was going to read it here for you. It's just a short story. It's going to be part of, well, bits of it are going to be weaved into the final book in the Into the West Saga serial, Into the West Family Ties, because there is something that happens at Christmas. So I'm going to use parts of this short story in the last book of that series. It's not going to be just copy and pasted. It's going to be, this bit is here and this bit is there. So it's going to be different than what I'm about to read to you. But I thought it would be something nice that I could share with you, and hopefully you will like it. So here we go. This is the tie-in short story. It is Christmas in a New Home. The author is listed as Dianne Burckhardt, my other pen name. And it's one chapter. Last Sunday of Advent. Stacy and Debbie were bustling around Deb's kitchen. Even though they had a heavy snowfall just days before, Tim and Stacy still bundled up the children and took the chance to head into town for Sunday services for the last day of Advent. The townsfolk all brought quilts and any coal they could spare to keep everyone warm in the church as they all gathered to celebrate one more time before Christmas. Elizabeth, Connor, and Timothy all huddled under one blanket together, talking and giggling before the services started. Stacy sat back and just watched them for a while. It was hard to believe they were all getting along so well, just a few short months after the McBrides came to town. Stacy looked at Elizabeth just as the girl looked up and smiled at her. She knew that little girl was the one who really brought them all together like this. A twinge of guilt hit Stacy for a moment. She had been so dead set against loving this girl. Part of her had thought it would take away from the love she had had for her own dearly departed daughter, Martha, if she loved this girl too. Stacy had to laugh at herself now. Having Elizabeth in her life had actually made her feel closer to Martha in some ways these last few months. She would always love her for that, and for so many other reasons. Pastor Matthews called everyone to order and services began. Timothy got up to go up front and light the Advent candles during the service. He was thrilled to be asked to do this and was beaming the rest of the afternoon. Barbara Master, the one who had been adopted by the town's matriarch Sharon Stevens, was asked to read the prayer as Timothy lit the candles. The girl had a pronounced limp, but she was intelligent, kind, and beautiful. As it turned out, she was also very good at reading aloud. As she went back to her seat, several people congratulated her on her reading. It was obvious that the person most impressed was her new mother. When the services finished, the Ruth family went with the Wellensteins back to their home for Sunday dinner. Deb Wellenstein and Stacy headed to the kitchen, while Doc Pete, the town doctor, and Stacy's husband Tim took the kids into the parlor to play games, while the family waited for dinner to be served. Deb and Stacy chatted happily about the children while they cooked the midday meal and set everything out on the sideboard. Tim and Doc had gone hunting the week before and got a few nice-sized quails and a turkey. The families had divided the quails between them, but decided since there was only one turkey, they would all have dinner together and enjoy it as one big family. Paige Turner, the barmaid at the Black Coyote Saloon in town, had been kind enough to smoke it for them in the saloon's big smokehouse. They often did that for families in town at the holidays. Patrick Gordon, the saloon owner, always said it was their gift to the families so they could all do a little less cooking and spend more time together at Christmas. When all the food was ready, the families gathered around the table. The adults all enjoyed a cup of negus while the children all had spiced apple cider. When everyone was settled, Deb brought in the turkey and placed it on the table in front of her husband for carving. As Doc sharpened his carving knife, he looked over at Timothy. "Son, why don't you do the honors today and say the grace for us?" said Doc. Timothy smiled and nodded at Doc and clasped his hands together as he bowed his head. "God is great. God is good. Let us thank him for this food." "Timothy, Ruth," said Stacy with obvious irritation. She had to smile when all the children began giggling and looking between themselves. It had obviously been planned. Stacy tried to keep her stern expression as she admonished her child. "Timothy, Ruth, you know very well that is not a proper grace. We have talked about this before." Timothy gave his mother a sheepish grin as he apologized. Doc Pete was doing his best not to smile and not doing a very good job of it. How about we give Elizabeth a go at it, said Doc as he winked at the girl. Can I do it? Asked Connor. I never get to do it. Doc smiled over at Connor. When the orphan train had come to Sharon Springs, he and Deb had not planned to adopt any children. Then they saw Connor, and now he couldn't even begin to imagine his life without this rambunctious little boy in it. Do you remember the words? Connor vigorously nodded his head as he gave Doc Pete the biggest grin. Doc couldn't help but laugh at his eagerness. Well then, let's hear it. I think we're all getting hungry. Connor bowed his head and clasped his hands. Connor paused for a while, and it was obvious that he was struggling with the words. Elizabeth leaned closer to him and whispered, For the home? Said Elizabeth. For the home we love, continued Connor. As Connor said the rest of the grace his mother had taught them, Elizabeth snuck glances at him and smiled. She brought one hand down from where they had been clasped together and pulled the St. Bridget's medal out from inside of her dress that hung on a string around her neck. She clasped it between her hands as they finished the prayer. The medallion had belonged to her birth mother, Margaret. When Margaret had turned her children over to the foundling home, because she could no longer care for them, she had given them each a St. Bridget's medal. She gave hers to Elizabeth, and Connor had the one that had belonged to their father before he died. Stacy watched as Elizabeth fingered the medallion she always wore. Then she glanced around the table. The scene made Stacy remember the last Christmas they had all had here together before they had lost Martha in the flood, and Doc and Deb had lost their little boy, Dylan, to the pox. They had only recently moved to Sharon Springs, and luckily the town had already built a home for their new town doctor as part of the compensation for him moving his family out west. Doc had talked to his best friend Tim Ruth and his family into joining the Wellensteins on this new adventure in the Western Territory. Tim and Stacy bought land, but it would be a while before their home could be built. Until it was finished, the families all lived in the Wellensteins' home in town. The first Christmas had been wonderful. The townsfolk had all been so welcoming and helpful. Stacy had been hesitant to move out west, but the folks of Sharon Springs had been so gracious to her and her family that she honestly couldn't imagine living anywhere better. Tim had always been handy at woodworking and spent several nights carving surprises for all of the children. He made them toys that were big and small, from spinning tops to a rocking horse for Dylan. On Christmas Eve, the families sat down together for dinner, just like now. They were having a goose that night that Doc had been given from a trapper. He had needed his leg stitched up after a slide down an icy hill had left him with a nasty cut. It was his payment for services rendered. Martha said grace, and after dinner they all went to the parlor and had punch and cake, while Doc Pete read them all the story of Jesus' birth from his Bible. Before he was finished with the passages, the children were already fast asleep. The men carried them up to bed as the women returned to the kitchen to clean up from the evening's festivities. When everything was put in order, the couples returned to the parlor to enjoy a cup of fresh hot apple cider while they wrapped the gifts for the children. Deb had saved back some flour sacks she had picked out at the mill in town with pretty red flowers printed on the sacks. It was something the town printer and the local miller did every year. The parents put the gifts into the sacks and tied them all up with pretty ribbons, then placed them under the tree for Christmas morning. They sat by the fire for a while longer as they had one last glass of cider and talked about the children and how they couldn't wait to see their faces when they opened their gifts in the morning. The next morning did not disappoint. The children were all thrilled with their gifts, and the house was filled with squeals of joy and laughter as the children played with their new toys. As Stacy and Tim sat cuddled on the sofa, they had no way to know how precious these memories would be later on. A knock on the front door brought Stacy back from her memories. Doc had just started to carve the turkey. Deb put her hand on his shoulder as she got up. "You go ahead, darling. I'll see who it is," said Deb as she went to the door. Doc carved the turkey as the children all playfully argued over who got what part. Deb was gone for a while, and when she came back, she seemed a bit more somber than before. Doc looked up at his wife and could also see the change in her demeanor. "Is something wrong, Deb?" he asked. "Does someone need doctoring?" Deb forced a smile and shook her head. No, dear, everything is all right. It was Phyllis. She got an interesting message from her cousin in Platte City and thought we would want to know about it, but it can wait until later. Deb glanced around the table at the children, and suddenly all of the parents felt a little on edge. It was obviously something to do with the children, and she didn't want to share it in front of them. It was a hard meal to get through, but the parents all put on a brave face for the children's sake. When the children were all finally tucked in bed for the night, the couples all retired to the parlor as Deb brought in the punch bowl of negus. "I think we're all going to need a bit of a stiff drink for this bit of news," she said as she handed out the glasses before taking her own and sitting beside Doc. "As I told you at dinner, that was Phyllis at the door. She thought we would want to know she got word from another operator up the line. A few of the operators on the orphan train route have kept in touch, sharing news on how the children have been doing in their new town since Mrs. Kelly." Deb paused for a while, but then composed herself and smiled around at the others. "Well, you all know what happened." The others nodded at her in agreement before she continued. "Well, apparently someone has been visiting towns along the train route and asking a lot of questions about which children were left where. It's got a few of the adoptive families nervous. Apparently all of the paperwork she had on where the children were left was destroyed in the fire." "You don't think someone is looking for their kin waiting to take them back to New York City, do you?" Deb shrugged. "Phyllis didn't have a lot of information. Apparently the person asking around is a hired man who can't give any information about the person who hired him. Phyllis said one of her connections said the man was very well dressed and spent quite a bit of money in town. So a few of the telegraph operators think his client has to be someone with money." Stacy had been squeezing Tim's hand in fear that someone might be looking for Elizabeth and Connor, but upon hearing that last bit of news, she relaxed. "Well, that is good news of sorts, at least. I mean, the person couldn't possibly be looking for our children. After all, we all know from Mrs. Kelly that our children's mother was destitute. That's why she gave them up to the children's home in the first place. There's no way she would have the money to hire such a man to look for her children. Right?" "We should not get ahead of ourselves," said Doc. "It could just be someone from the Catholic Church in New York City looking to check on all the children that were placed." The adults all nodded in agreement, but at the same time, the mood had definitely shifted. Tim hugged his wife to his side. "Don't you worry about a thing, darling," he said as he kissed her temple. "I promise you this. Our daughter is not going anywhere." Stacy smiled up at Tim and leaned into him. "Thank you," she said as she laid her head on his shoulder. The next morning, the families decided to go ahead and open all the gifts so Tim and Stacy could head back to their ranch earlier than planned. Phyllis's visit had made Tim and Stacy want to get their family back to the safety of their own home as quick as possible. Elizabeth and Connor hated to say goodbye again, but Doc promised he and Deb would bring Connor out to the Ruth's place so they could all spend the new year together. The thought of all of them being further from town just seemed like a good idea to them all. Late in the afternoon, the Ruths loaded up their wagon and headed back home. When Stacy stepped into their cabin and watched her children run upstairs to play with their new toys together, she knew in that moment she was ready to fight tooth and nail against anyone who might want to break up her happy family. Tim stepped up beside her and took her hand in his. Stacy jumped a little at being startled and looked down at their hands. She looked up at her husband and smiled. Tim smiled back as he squeezed her hand reassuringly. "No one is going to take our daughter from us," said Tim. "I give you my word on that. She made us a real family again, and I'm sure shootin' not going to let anyone take that from us." Stacy nodded and smiled, but she just had this sick feeling in her gut. Something was coming. Something that was going to tear apart all the happiness they had just worked so hard to get back in their lives. The one good thing she tried to focus on was that she knew without a doubt that whatever was coming, they were going to face it all together as a family, no matter what. Days, weeks, months, and even years passed, but nothing came bringing bad tidings for the Wellensteins or the Ruths. They celebrated birthdays, Founders' Days, Christmases, and more, and were still all together. It was a few years later when once again the Ruths and the Wellensteins were all in Doc and Deb's home in Sharon Springs. The town had gotten together and built him a proper doctor's office with a few patient rooms out behind his home in town. That meant the patient rooms they had been using in their home were now just guest rooms. One had been turned into a permanent bedroom for Elizabeth for the night she came into town to visit Connor. The families were once again all gathered around the table as Elizabeth brought out the ham they were having for dinner that night. A few wild boars had been causing problems in the valley, and some of the men went hunting for them. Now, instead of causing problems, they were giving several families a very merry Christmas feast. Elizabeth set the ham in front of Doc Pete, and he carved everyone generous slices of smoked ham. Timothy said grace this year, and actually did it properly without any jokes or false starts like his usual attempts. The families all ate their fill and joked about not needing to eat again until after winter. The men were heading off to the parlor, and the women were clearing the table when there was a knock at the door. "I got it," yelled Doc as he headed for the front door. When he opened the door, a rather well-dressed man was standing there with a black ankle-length fur coat on. The collar was pulled up around his neck to protect him from the cold Kansas winds. "Step in out of the cold," said Doc as he sidestepped to give the stranger room to come in. The stranger took off his bowler hat and slapped it a few times to get the snow off of it before he stepped into the house. "Thank you very much, sir." Doc closed the door and rubbed his arms to warm himself up a bit from the chill of the wind coming in the open door. "What can I do for you, Mr. Doc waited for the stranger to provide his name. The man held out his hand to Doc as he answered. "I'm Mr. Codsworth, Walter Codsworth. I work for the Pinkerton Detective Agency in New York City. I've been on the case for a few years trying to rebuild the records of all the children who were adopted from the orphan train that came into these parts in 1859. I've been told you might know where I can find a few of the children who were brought here to Sharon Springs." Doc's heart was beating fast, but he tried to appear composed. At least, he hoped he did. He nodded at the man, but said nothing just yet. Mr. Codsworth waited for a moment for more of an answer from Doc, but when he didn't get it, he went on. "You see, sir, my firm has been hired to locate a brother and a sister. Their mother had no idea the children would be put on the orphan train and brought into the West. We've been hired by her benefactor to locate them. Do you happen to know where I can find an Elizabeth and Connor McBride?" Before Doc could say a word, there was a gasp and a loud crash in the kitchen. The sound was definitely dishes shattering on the floor. This Christmas was not going to be as merry as they had hoped. So there you go. That is the end of my story. I'm sure you might be a little bit upset that it ends on a cliffhanger, but it is a cliffhanger series, so of course the short story would also end on a cliffhanger. But don't worry, I absolutely promise that whenever we finish out Into the West Family Ties, you will be happy with the ending. I will not be mean. I will not tease. I will give it a good, solid close. So it will not end with a cliffhanger. But I am going to set it up so that we can take some of these characters from Into the West Saga serial, and I want to take them into a different territory and have them start a new life in a different territory, and have the second Saga serial, because it's the territory sagas is what I'm trying to build, is different sagas in different territories before they became states in the United States. So hopefully we'll be able to do that with some of these characters. I haven't quite figured out exactly who will be moving, but I have a good idea. And I hope that you will be sure to keep watching my social media coming up in January whenever we start up the blogs again, because I'm hoping that we will have some publication information for that final book in Into the West Saga serial. I want to close that out because I want to finish my book that I started working on as Dianne Burckhardt, the thriller that is called The Touch. That one is also coming up. And since I did win the award with the She Inspires Award for their Shiro category, I decided now is probably a good time to finally write my specific autobiography that's just going to cover the brain surgeries that I went through and the rare neurological conditions that I have. I want to do a short biography that explains the process that I went through with all of the surgeries and the recovery, and how I've managed to do all of these things that my doctors, that a majority of my doctors, there were some that were very supportive of everything that I did, but most of the doctors that I was seeing at the time had told me that I would never get better, I would never work again, I should just live on narcotics, go on Social Security disability, And I did not like that answer. So I told them if they didn't have the answers for me, I would find them myself. And I worked with my general practitioner and I found the answers I needed. And I went on to go back to work. I went back full time. I started working in a warehouse carrying boxes all day long, which they said would be completely impossible for me. I became a manager. I got married. I moved to Europe. I started writing books. I started doing a podcast and TikTok and all of these other things. Everything that they told me that I would never be able to do, I did. So I want to share that story with people because I'm hoping that it will give them the courage to look for their own answers when people don't have them for them. So hopefully these are some of the things that are going to be coming up this next year. And I've also got so many fantastic people that are going to be coming on as guests for the podcast in 2023. So please do join me when we start up again. And I hope that you enjoyed the story and that you all have a very, very Merry Christmas, a fantastic holiday season. If you celebrate Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or any of the others, any of the other numerous holidays that are celebrated at this time of year. Sorry, I can't think of all of them right now. But I hope whatever it is that you celebrate, it is a wonderful time of year for you and that 2023 will be amazing. I'll talk to you all again the first week of February of 2023. So now, you know what time it is. It is time for you to go forth. And since it's the holidays, make merry.